I bring Julian up, I just want to say that, I will give gratitudes for all of my staff, but Marcella Paris, I don't know where she is, she's back there, worked really, really hard on this. And I remember when she first was like, what about, we're looking for speakers, and she suggested Julian, and I was like, I just don't know if he would ever want to come here and speak to us. And we are so excited that you said yes. We're so excited you said yes. So please welcome Julian Brave NoiseCat.
Got a report for my mom, so 1 second. All right. Way high, ya, ho, way, oh, way, ah, hey, oh. So for those of you who don't know, that is the lead to the AIM song, the American Indian Movement song. I'm going to get back to that in a second. Yeah. So anyone here ever been to Oakland? Oakland, California, not Oakland, Maine. Okay, about half the hands went down. All right, anybody who's been to Oakland, International Boulevard, does that mean anything to you? Maybe one person, okay. All right, that's, 2 people, okay, that's about what I expected. If you're in the Zoom chat, do whatever people do in the Zoom chat. So if you're driving down International Boulevard is like the main inner city thoroughfare in Oakland, California, particularly in East Oakland, which is sort of the inner city of Oakland. And if you're driving down International Boulevard from south to north, headed towards Lake Merritt, towards downtown Oakland, towards Laney College, actually, which I don't know if any of you, doesn't strike me as a sports crowd, but there's a great season of Last Chance U that's focused on the Laney College, community college football team. An important part of Oakland lore. So if you're driving that way down International Boulevard, you eventually get to this small neighborhood that's essentially like the little Saigon of Oakland. It's like a Vietnamese American community in Oakland. And suddenly, when you're in the middle of like this Oakland's little Saigon, if you're paying close attention, you'll pass by this small community center on the west side of the street with a garden that's lined with all these murals of Indian guys mostly, and it is mostly guys. So one of them happens to be Chief Dan George. I don't know if any of you are Western film buffs, but Chief Dan George played, it was in The Little Big Man. He was like one of the main early Native actors in Hollywood. And then there's some other uncles up on the walls there. And, it's kind of, in my opinion, it's hard to miss this community center. And it's called the Intertribal Friendship House. It's really sort of the heart of the urban Indian community in Oakland, California, and in the East Bay more broadly. It was founded in 1955, which makes it actually the 3rd oldest Indigenous community organization in the entire United States. And I don't know what you guys know about Oakland, California, but Oakland is generally considered a pretty progressive and diverse place, right? It's the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. Black Lives Matter has some of its origins in Oakland, California. It's one of the most diverse cities, not just in the country, but in the entire world. And you'd think that in a city like Oakland, people would know about a place like the Intertribal Friendship House. Here's the 3rd oldest urban Indigenous organization in the entire country. And yet, you'd be shocked how many people I run into who are lifelong Oaklanders who don't know a thing about the Intertribal Friendship House, who don't know a thing also about the occupation of Alcatraz, which was a 19-month, as you all know, as you've read the book, occupation of the site of the former federal prison that in a sense, I would describe it as kind of the Montgomery bus boycott of the Indigenous rights movement in the United States. And I say that because it was a starting point for what is a continuing movement for Indigenous peoples' rights, self-determination, and sovereignty. And it actually really engendered a moment of transformation for our people. During that occupation, President Richard Nixon, of all people, actually shifted the United States' stated policy towards Native peoples from one of termination, that was the actual phrase that was used for almost 20 years, to one of self-determination. So Alcatraz and the Alcatraz occupation was this incredibly momentous moment in Native history in the United States, Indigenous history globally, and also just in United States history. And again, in this place, Oakland, California, the Bay Area, where people usually celebrate those kinds of histories. You know, they know about Huey, they know about Bobby Seale, you know, they know about Cesar Chavez. You know, we celebrate Cesar Chavez Day in California. People don't know about the Alcatraz occupation. They don't know who one of the leaders of that occupation were, people like Richard Oakes, people like Lynetta Warjack. And, you know, so it's really, what I'm getting at here is that in the middle of East Oakland, this main thoroughfare that if you know Oakland and that if you're driving through Oakland, you cannot avoid, you come upon this, one of the oldest urban Indigenous community organizations in the entire country. It's really not just an old community organization, but it's also central to this really important history for Native people and for this entire country. And people don't know about it. But I happen to know about it. And I want to talk a little bit about that and about Oakland today. And about my memories of that place, that community, and the people that animate that community. You know, growing up, I spent a lot of time at the Intertribal Friendship House. I remember running around that courtyard where there was at the time a big sandbox with a play structure in it that could give you tetanus if you weren't careful. There were many elders who were part of the relocation of Native people to cities like Oakland, people like Grandma Wakazu, whose lap I would sit in because I was too scared to get out there and dance at Thursday night drum and dance practice at the Intertribal Friendship House. I guess I was a little bit like Orville Redfeather in there in that way. There were many gray-haired elders who were a bit younger during the Alcatraz occupation. There were adults who were kids during the Alcatraz occupation. And there was also a good number of people who were living on the streets, but who we all related to also as relatives, who we called grandma and grandpa and auntie and uncle. There's a woman named Jean Ann who would call someone I'm going to talk about later today, Eloy Martinez. She'd call him Cook every time he saw him because he would cook, he would chef up pretty good. And you know, there were families that were all actually living on the streets. There was this one family that went by 3 different names. It's like one of the most Indian stories that you can get out of Oakland. They went by Shot with 2 arrows, Shoots 2 arrows, Shot twice, and Shots. Actually, that's 4 names. And they were Lakota, originally from South Dakota, and they were all living on the streets. So it was a very, what I'm getting at here is that it was a very, very vibrant urban Native community that I was growing up in. And that every Thursday night, you know, this was a community that also really valued its history and its culture. And every Thursday night at powwow drum and dance practice, they would have all of us, the young ones and everybody else, gather around the All Nations Drum, which was the drum group that is still there actually at the Intertribal Friendship House. And they'd have us sing the American Indian Movement song, the AIM song, the song that I began my talk with, because they thought it was really important for the younger generation, the kids, to know about this part of our history, the history of the Alcatraz occupation, the history of ourselves, not just as Native people from the many different reservations and communities that we originally came from, but also as Native people who were from Oakland and who were native to Oakland. And so we'd all gather around and after that lead, everybody would join in and it would go way ha, ya, hey ya, ya, way ha, ya, hey ya, ya, way ha, ya, oh, way ya, hey yo. All right. Oh, just lost my talk here. So, Chokwi good morning, or as it literally means, you all survived the night. Letwen Poopsman Hochayulham to Penobscot Ulo. It's good to be here today on Penobscot land. Thank you for inviting me here to your readers retreat, which feels like the biggest book club that I've probably ever been a part of. I'll just say that getting here was a little bit of a trek. I flew into Boston and then I drove 4 hours, and then when I got here this morning, we happen to be on a university where there is not a single printer that is working because of this power outage. I'll also say that like driving up here, I was in Canada last weekend. My people are originally from Canada, and man, like Canada's got nothing on Maine, man. Like you guys, like you don't want to end winter over here. It was like 60 degrees up in Canada last weekend. All right, Julian Brave NoiseCat wen Chechwa, Sequachmoch ken Statlim ken L'chaim ken Eth. My name is Julian Brave NoiseCat. Oh, I forgot about my clicker. So my name is Julian Brave NoiseCat. I'm a member of the Secwepemc Nation and the Statlian Nation. Oh wait, that's not what I need. I need the slides. I'll just keep talking while we figure this out. We're just gonna have to embrace, this is the nature of the day. It told us this when we got here this morning. We're just all gonna have to embrace that. Okay, great. Oh, great, okay, it's working. All right, yeah, so my name is Julian Brave NoiseCat. There is a really wonderful introduction about me, so I'm not gonna add too much more. I'm just gonna talk briefly about my work quickly and how I'm coming to what I'm talking about and approaching all of it. So my nations are the Secwepemc and Statlian nations. Language I just spoke to is the Secwepemc language. I had the privilege to learn it from my grandmother, who's still with us and one of the last remaining fluent speakers of our language. As I said in my language, I'm also a storyteller. So the way that people usually describe this, I guess in English, is that I'm a writer and a filmmaker. I have two sort of projects that I've been working on the last 3-4 years. One of them is called Sugarcane. It's a documentary, as was mentioned, about an investigation into missing children and abuse at St. Joseph's Mission, which is the Indian residential school that my family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia, Canada. Sugarcane premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, where me and my co-director, Emily Cassie, shared the directing award in the US documentary competition, which was really far out, honestly. I should also mention that Sugarcane's composer is a resident of Maine. Her name is Molly Obamsawin. She's from the First Nation of Odanak, which is up in Quebec. She's an incredible musician, jazz, folk, multi-instrumentalist. She did an incredible job on the score for Sugarcane, and I introduce her so that I can introduce and tease a little bit her partner, who just snapped a photo with me, Lakota Sanborn, who I have gotten also to know through the making of Sugarcane, Lakota's Penobscot. And when Lakota and I were texting yesterday about this talk, he was like, yeah, you know, they always have these Indians from out west coming to Maine to talk to us about being Indian. And I was thinking about it, I was like, oh, that's me. And then I thought about it a little bit more, and then I was like, hold on a second, this is a Penobscot guy named Lakota. Yeah. That's on me, man. That's not my fault. Anyways, in addition to Sugarcane, I'm also finishing up my first book. It's called We Survived the Night. It's a little bit hard to describe, which maybe is a problem. But it's a nonfiction book. I guess that's important to get out there. It combines memoir, family history, reportage, and elements of oral history, particularly the coyote stories that my people tell, which are our trickster tales. It's going to be published by Alfred A. Knopf, and then it'll also be published in the UK and Commonwealth by Profile Books, by Albin Michel in France, if any of you read French. I know there's some French speakers in Maine, and by Aufbau Verlag in Germany. I actually just got back my edits on my manuscript this week, so if this talk feels thrown together, it's because I was very preoccupied with these edits on my manuscript. I'm just kidding. I actually spent some time thinking about this. Yeah, so it'll be out sometime next year, question mark, I think. Yeah. The next thing I should say is where I come from, because that's really what this talk is about, or at least one of those places. So I usually, when I introduce myself, I say Tsq'escen, which Tsq'escen, and to Oakland, which Tsq'escen. So the first place I said is Tsq'escen, which is the Canim Lake Indian Reserve, which is in what is now British Columbia, Canada. I'm not going to talk too much about that place today, although that is a place that is very near and dear to my heart, and it's where I will eventually return when it's my time to return to the earth. But the place I really want to talk about more is the other homeland, the other place that I consider home, and that's Oakland, California. And to get into the importance of place a little bit, I thought that I would begin a little bit with a quote, a very brief quote from the late great Kiowa author N. Scott Momaday, who taught at UC Berkeley and was actually at UC Berkeley while the Alcatraz occupation was beginning, which is a little literary history fact that very few people know. He actually taught one of the leaders of the Alcatraz occupation at UC Berkeley. And N. Scott Momaday writes, in some important ways, place determines who and what we are. The land-person equation is essential to writing, to all of literature. So as someone who grew up in Oakland, California, the setting for there, I know intimately a lot of the places that are brought up in this novel and in his sequel and prequel, Wandering Stars. The Indian Center that he talks about is the Intertribal Friendship House, for example. And as I said, I really want to, in this talk, give you guys a sense for that place and the people, the native people of Oakland, and some of the history of that place, because I think that might be helpful in your guys' understanding and appreciation of this wonderful, wonderful book. I also just wanted to walk through a little bit part of the context behind sort of the setting. So I want to talk a little bit, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Bay Area and California and its genocide against California Indians. I'm going to talk a little bit about the relocation and era of Native people being moved to, American Indian people being moved to the Bay Area. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Alcatraz occupation, and I'm also going to talk about the legacies of these things in activism and art in the Bay Area. And I think that should get us plenty of the way to a nice conversation. So it's great to be here, and here goes. So this is a picture of me as a kid. Just kidding. No, this is a painting by this German-Russian guy who visited the Bay Area in the early 1800s named Louis Chorus. I think that's how you say it. It might be Louis Chorus. I don't know. I'm American, man. Anyways, so it's a painting of these Ohlone. I assume that it's two men and someone else in a Thule raft or a Thule boat, which is the traditional vessel that the Ohlone would use to travel across the marshes and parts of the Bay Area, although the Bay Area is a very wild waterway. I think that the point here that I want to talk about a little bit is that California was actually the most densely populated and also diverse places in North America. before colonization. As California is today, a very populated place, California before the arrival of Europeans was incredibly densely populated in North America, and was also home to dozens and dozens of native nations. The Ohlone are the native nation, or native people from what is now the Bay Area, although there were also some Coast Miwok people in parts of the Bay Area. When you go to the Bay Area today, it's kind of hard to get a full sense of what the place may have been like before colonization. There are certain spots in the Bay where you can get a little bit of it. So there's like marshlands in parts of the Bay that those would have been much broader. The flatlands, which are now almost entirely paved everywhere, would have looked like sort of savannas with bunch grasses that could be as tall as a child. And then in the hills, where you can get a better sense for what this landscape was and could be like, you had these really incredible forests full of redwood and oak, of course, it's called Oakland. And there were at one point in time a lot of game in this area, a lot of fish, a lot of shellfish. There were wolves, there were grizzly bears, which are now entirely extinct in the state of California. There were elk, which you only can get in very specific parts of California and were reintroduced in some parts of California. Deer, there were salmon, which my people loved salmon, so maybe we should have moved to the Bay Area too. And it was such a good place for the Ohlone that they would leave these big, what archaeologists call middens, but essentially like these big piles of shells and refuse, food, all these other things, all across the bay. And some of them had been piled up for so long that they grew to be like 2 to 3 stories high, which was kind of, I guess, a testament to the fact that they were eating really well and living a good life. And now to this day, actually, there's this sort of phenomenon where whenever they build in various places in the bay, they often run into these shell mounds as well as burial grounds. And this is just sort of part of the long sort of ghosting legacy of the fact that this was a very rich place at one point in time, ecologically. And every time they try to develop something new or rebuild something, they run into the memory of that truth. And various Europeans who first visited the Bay remarked on this. So one of the first guys to visit Monterey Bay, which is just to the south of San Francisco Bay, remarked that there were so many whales approaching his vessel that he could actually smell their spouts, which is like a totally far out thing to imagine for me. Upon entering San Francisco Bay, the Spanish said that there were so many sea lions that they covered the bay like a pavement. And that's actually the quote from one of their journals. And a French sea captain said that this area said, quote, "There is not any country in the world which more abounds in fish and game of every description." So it was, again, an incredibly rich place. Then in 1769, as I guess Europeans were wont to do in this part of the world, this guy named Junipero Serra hobbled into Alta California. He had a pretty significant injury. He had an ulcerated leg, actually, and asthmatic lungs. And he founded 9 missions between what is now San Diego and what is now San Francisco. And the one that was founded in San Francisco, the northernmost of those, is now colloquially called Mission Dolores. It was founded in 1776. Two more missions soon followed in the Bay Area, one at Santa Clara and another in San Jose. And at these missions, there was what was called a policy of reducción in Spanish. And that's a policy wherein indigenous peoples were separated from their communities and their families and coerced into what one historian describes as spiritual debt peonage. So it was a very hard life at missions. They were very crowded places. They could accurately be described as work camps. and they were rife with disease. So for example, at Mission Dolores in 1806, there was a measles outbreak that infected some 800 residents there, mostly all Ohlone, and killed 337 of them, which is a just astonishing death rate. So because these missions were so deadly to California Indians, by 1833, which is a good deal before California becomes part of the United States, missionaries, Franciscan missionaries, had baptized 82,000 California Indians and buried 63,000, which is again just like an astonishing number of people to die. Really hard to fathom. Journalists, one journalist described the missions as, and maybe this is a little bit loaded given the verbiage, but this is a quote, Nazis operating concentration camps. Perhaps surprisingly, when I was a kid, the missions were actually celebrated, which was a little bit off. And in fact, until very recently, until 2017, all California fourth graders had to build a model mission as part of a mandatory school project. It seems like maybe one of you guys know about the, yeah, okay, you built a mission too, huh? Yeah, okay, there's a meeting afterwards. We deeper get okay about everything. So, you know, when little me was asked to build a model mission, you're supposed to build these model missions to scale, right? So if, you know, it's 10 feet, then you've got to make the thing like 10 inches or whatever. I thought, you know, I interpreted the term scale, I guess, at the time a little bit liberally. And so I just decided to make the crosses in the graveyard taller than the actual church. And I was like, grade me on that. So that was my my interpretation of to scale. But really interestingly, you know, and this detail has always struck me, and it doesn't appear in there, but I did want to share it with you all. Before colonization and before the Ohlone were converted to Christianity, they believed that in death, the spirits that departed would depart the Bay Area through the Golden Gate and go out across the Pacific to where they considered to be the land of the dead, which is actually very similar to my own people's belief. We also believed that the land of the dead was out across the Pacific. And before crossing over to that other side, the Ohlone believed that the spirits of the dead would actually linger at Alcatraz Island. So I think that it's actually very fitting and poetic that Alcatraz, in a way, became this site for later Native activism, given its significance in the beliefs of the Ohlone people. And of course, you know, there was a lot of death, as I mentioned. So one of my favorite pictures of the Alcatraz occupation, that's John Fidel, the TV being very, but if you know who John Fidel is, it's like a very John Fidel photo. All right, so the story unfortunately gets a little bit darker even. It's hard for a story like this to get a little bit darker, but it does get darker when California becomes part of the United States. So in 1848, as some of you may know, gold is discovered at what's now called Sutter's Mill on the American River, which is a river in the Sierra Nevada foothills. It's in the traditional homelands of the Nisenan people. And once word of this gets out, especially in 1849, many prospectors from Oregon and across the United States start coming to California. And there's this incident very early on in the California gold rush where these prospectors from Oregon come down and they attempt to do rape some Nisenan women. I'm sorry about the subject matter here. It is going to get a little heavy. The Nisenan then retaliate, and then the Oregonians went on a killing spree where in about a month they killed 100 Nisenan people, and that was kind of the beginning of California's entry into the United States. not legally, but more or less sort of the real way in which this happened. So very quickly after that, California became, and this is, historians generally agree on this point, California actually became one of the most dangerous places in the entire world for Indigenous peoples, and definitely the most dangerous place in the United States to be an Indian. In 1850, so just the next year, the United States military killed an estimated 800 Pomos at a place called Bloody Island on Clear Lake, which is up in sort of northern California. And to this day, actually, the Bloody Island massacre, as it's now known, and appropriately known, is actually the largest massacre in United States history. Very, very poorly known part of American history, but happened in California. And these sort of acts of vigilante violence and mass killing were actually soon formalized into an actual statewide policy in California. There's this historian, Benjamin Madley, who's written this book, An American Genocide, about this, and he describes, in his words, he describes this history, this policy as creating a quote, killing machine. In the 1850s and 1860s, state-sponsored settler militias received more than $1 million from the state of California, which back then was even more money than it is now. And they murdered an estimated 16,000 California Indians. And in the words of one elected official at the time, these were, quote, pedagogic killings. The idea being that they would teach the Indians a lesson by killing them. This is, I think it's really important to understand, part of how you get a place like Oakland where people don't know that it's an Indian place still. In many parts of California, including Bay Area, California Indians were so reduced in number that many started, for reasons of survival, to identify as Hispanic. They also, of course, were colonized initially at Spanish missions, so many of them still to this day have Spanish or Hispanic last names. And it's also, I think, part of how you get the quote that is in part the reference of the title of Orange's book there. So in Gertrude Stein, of course, is the one, well, there's the Radiohead song, but so I can't speak to the Radiohead song, but there's Gertrude Stein, right? So Gertrude Stein grows up in Oakland, and then she goes off and starts having this career, and then she comes back. And when she grew up in Oakland, Oakland was, you know, this very sleepy, small, mostly farming sort of town across the bay from San Francisco, and she comes back, and it's now the beginnings of the city. And so when she says there is no there, my understanding she's really referring to is the fact that the memories of this place that she knew and she knew very intimately and grew up in, you know, that there is no longer there. That's what she's talking about. And in a way, I actually think that quote is actually also very apt. This is not what she was really, I think, explicitly talking about, but it actually gets at it as well. This transformation of this place via the processes of what academics now call settler colonialism, the form of colonialism where settlers come to replace the Indigenous peoples and eliminate the Indigenous peoples, is what Gertrude Stein is in part talking about, because this place, by the time she comes back in the early 1900s, is so completely transformed by, firstly, we should say this process of murder, of genocide, but also then by processes of paving over the marshlands, dredging the bay, and implementing these systems of levees on the Sacramento River Delta, and all of these other things that are really transforming the California landscape. Hydroelectric projects are actually another big part of them, that they're no longer recognizable. And then Oakland really sort of starts to come to be what I would consider the Oakland that I know, in the sort of post-war period after Stein, a good time after Stein makes that comment, with the Great Migration. So in the post-war period, as many of you probably know, African Americans start to depart and also in their own ways flee the Jim Crow South, because it's violent, because it's racist. And one of the places that they end up going to is Oakland, actually. One of the places that is a location on the Great Migration is Oakland. And it's in this period that you have policies of redlining, in particular in Oakland, this history of building freeways through working class communities of color that then segregate those communities and devalue the real estate in those communities compared to middle class, predominantly white communities in places like the Oakland Hills. And once this sort of history of really transforming and then, bringing in this racialized landscape that is, very familiar in American cities happens, that's when you really get Oakland. And by the early 2000s, this statistic I was able to find, a Black child born in the Oakland Flatlands, so a place like East Oakland where International Boulevard runs through, a Black child was expected to live about 15 years shorter than a white child born in the more affluent Oakland Hills, just a mile or two away. Interestingly, there are no similar statistics that you can find about Native people in Oakland. Because of course, by the time we get to the early 2000s, California generally and Oakland specifically is no longer considered an Indian place by people who are not Indian. But that's not the way we think about it. Man, I feel like whenever I have to talk about history, it's like all heavy stuff. All right, so everybody take a deep breath. We're gonna talk about the residential and boarding schools now. The trials and tribulations of the Native people they're quite something. All right, so I'm sure many of you really enjoyed There. The sequel/prequel to that book is called Wandering Stars, and one of the primary antagonists, if not the primary antagonist of that novel, is actually a real life historical figure. His name is Captain Richard Henry Pratt. And he was a military figure, and he was also the superintendent of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was kind of the first Native American boarding school in the United States. And not that far south of here, actually in Boston in 1892, in what was called the progressive, ironically called the progressive era in politics, where many problems, including the quote unquote Indian problem, were believed to be able to be addressed through policy. Pratt gives this speech to a bunch of people who care about the Indian problem in Boston. And there's this line from it that is still quoted to this day. He says, quote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." This idea of killing the Indian and saving the man, of what in Canada is now called a cultural genocide, this ideology, it soon became actual law across North America. In Canada, actually, the Indian residential school system became compulsory through a reform to the Indian Act in 1894. In Canada, there's a guy named Duncan Campbell Scott who really echoes this sentiment. Across the United States and Canada, a system of schools is built to assimilate and acculturate Native people. I'll give a few examples of those schools. So there's Chemawa in Oregon, which is a school that many people from the West Coast are sent to, including many California Indians. There's, as I mentioned, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, which appears in Wandering Stars, the sequel to There. And in Canada, in the United States, there's over 400 federally funded American Indian boarding schools. In Canada, there's 139 Indian residential schools is what they're called in Canada. And the one that my family was actually sent to a few of those because my people were originally from Canada. We were sent to one called St. Mary's, which is in Mission, British Columbia. We were also sent to the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Kamloops, British Columbia, which is As some of you may recall, the school where there was a discovery of over 200 potential unmarked graves a few years ago, which sort of ignited the latest round of coverage of this history and this issue. And then there's St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake, which is the school that is a subject of sugarcane. And in sugarcane, I don't want to get too much down this rabbit hole. My father was actually born at St. Joseph's Mission, and through the investigation that we follow in that documentary, we uncover, and Williams Lake First Nation in its investigation uncovers what I think can accurately be described as a system of infanticide. So at St. Joseph's Mission, there was a system wherein babies born to students and to nuns, some of whom were actually fathered by the priests at the school themselves, a good number were fathered by the priests themselves, were being the mothers were being forced into adoptions, or sort of abortions. The children are being adopted out of these families and out of this community. And there was also, this is the most troubling, babies who were being found, babies who were being put into the incinerator at the school to be burned alive. It's very, very, very heavy subject. There's more about that in the documentary, including my family's very close connection to all that. Okay, so that's the Native American boarding school experience and the Indian residential school experience. As you might read in Wandering Stars, though, people do actually meet each other at these schools, and some of the connections and family lines that still endure to this day actually also do come out of these schools and this experience. So I guess in genocide there could be like some silver linings. I don't know. The history continues with more heavy stuff. I told you this is not great. It's not a great context setting for any Indian story. So as I mentioned, there's this history of termination. So the history of termination is in many ways sort of an extension of the history of the Native American boarding school experience. It's usually dated to the Kansas Act of 1940s, usually identified as the beginning of the termination era. What happens during termination is that dozens of American Indian tribes are legally terminated. So they no longer exist as distinct sovereign entities in United States law. The idea being that the United States doesn't want to be in the business of dealing with sovereign Indian nations anymore. They want us to just become Americans. And the period of relocation that really brings many Native people to a city like Oakland begins with the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. And it's actually a very, very big diasporic process, I would say. By 1960, there's actually 31,000 Native people. So just 4 years after the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, there's 31,000 Native people who are relocated to cities like Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago, the Twin Cities in Minnesota, Cleveland, and of course, Oakland. And this is sort of really the historic backdrop, I would say, that creates Oakland into an urban indigenous community with American Indians who are not mostly themselves California Indians, but Indians from elsewhere who have been moved to a city like Oakland. I use very, very, very glancingly the term diasporic because I think that it actually, in other contexts, people talk about diasporic peoples, and I think that we don't usually think about indigenous peoples as diasporic peoples because those terms are in contradiction, right? Like to be indigenous literally etymologically means to be rooted and from a place, to be a person native to a particular place. And yet, there is this very significant part of the Native experience, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, of people being moved to or moving to cities away from our reservations and homelands in most instances. And this, in a way, I think makes us into a sense, kind of a diasporic people in certain places. And today, actually, that is the predominant Native experience. So statistics on this aren't great, but about 70% of Native people in the United States actually live in cities today. And this is one of my favorite photos you can find of this history. This woman named Sarah Brown with her niece and nephew in front of the Intertribal Friendship House in Oakland, and it's actually still in the same spot today. It still has some of the same paintings on the outside. So this is where the story I think gets a little bit more upbeat and exciting. So I'm sorry for dropping you guys down into some heavy stuff, but I think it's really necessary to get through to talk about really what makes Oakland into a place that is not seen as Native, but that it is Native and how it becomes a Native place. So in the 1960s, the Bay Area is a very dynamic and exciting place. It is in many ways sort of the quintessential 1960s location. If you read John Gideon, right, like slouching towards Bethlehem is about the Haight-Ashbury, right? So there's a lot of the 60s history that unfolds here, or well, there in the Bay Area. You have the free speech movement at UC Berkeley. You have civil rights, which sort of becomes later Black nationalism and the Black Panther Party, which is founded in Oakland. Cesar Chavez is doing actually some of his first community organizing in the Fruitvale district in Oakland, California. Not many people know that, but his origins and roots are partially there. You have the United Farm Workers, you have the Chicano movement more broadly. You also have this very significant Filipino farm worker movement. All these different things are happening. And then you also have sort of the Vietnam, in the later 60s, you have the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. And so I just want to talk a little bit about that milieu and about someone who I really love named Eloy Martinez, who is essentially like an uncle to me, not by blood, but sort of, I guess, in what we would sometimes describe as the Indian way. So Eloy tells a story about going to anti-war protest in the late 60s, and he's got a few kids, and he's married to this woman named Lisi, and Lisi makes all these sandwiches, and the kids are running around at the protest, and they meet some other kids, and those other kids come over, and Lisi's feeding those other kids, and then it's pretty obvious that these other kids are also Native kids, and then their parents come over, and the father of the guy, father of the kids, is this guy named Richard Oakes, who Richard Oakes is a name that I think everybody who cares about his history should know, but many people don't know who he is. He was one of the leaders of the Alcatraz occupation. He's a Mohawk guy, so his people are from the Northeast. He's an iron worker who then goes to school and goes out west to go to college. And he becomes one of the leaders of the Alcatraz occupation. And that day, Eloy and Richard have this little interaction that Eloy likes to retell, where basically Richard asks Eloy, because Eloy is Ute and Chicano, so he's both Indigenous and Latino. When are Latinos, when are Chicanos at the time was the term, going to recognize they're Native? And Eloy looks at him and he thinks about it for a second. He says, I don't know, maybe about the same time that Native people start recognizing that we are. So anyways, this is just all to say that this is a really exciting and interesting time in the Bay Area. In 1964, there's the first attempted takeover of Alcatraz Island by Russell Means under a clause in the Fort Laramie Treaty that says that the Lakota people are allowed to reclaim lands that are not being used by the federal government. There's the Third World strikes at San Francisco State, which lead to the creation of the very first ethnic studies departments in the United States. And that's actually directly in the lead up to the Alcatraz occupation. And then there's this really, I guess this sort of happenstance thing that happened, which is that the San Francisco American Indian Community Center burns down. And so the Native community in San Francisco is now without a cultural homes, without a community center. And it just so happens that there's this conversation happening about what are we gonna do with Alcatraz Island? Alcatraz is no longer a federal prison. There's all these ideas at the time that it might, ironically, one of them is actually that it's gonna be turned into a casino, not an Indian casino, just like a casino. And so there's this big conversation happening in the Bay Area about what are we gonna do with Alcatraz? And there's this history of this prior attempt at an occupation. And so this idea starts to be talked about of like, let's retake Alcatraz again under the Fort Laramie Treaty. And the guy who really wants to try to do it again, his name is Adam Nordwall. He's an Ojibwe man who lives in the Bay Area. His son is he has this famous regalia that he's wearing in a lot of photos, and his son still wears that regalia. His son's a really good brass dancer. He can like do the splits while he dances. But nobody really likes, at the time, nobody really likes Adam Nordwall as a leader, so they decide to try to start this occupation while he's out of town. This is just the history. This is not my judgment. This is just me telling you the history, okay? So the students especially are like, let's do it while this guy's gone. And so these college students, they get this idea to board this vessel and they go scope it out. And Leneda Warjack, name I mentioned earlier, they're like getting ready for this vessel, and then Richard, I guess, is really late because Native men are always late. And so he comes running and she like gives him a minute to like get onto the boat, but they almost leave him there. Which is also a really sort of fortuitous turn because Richard ends up getting on this boat, and there's this kind of famous moment, at least in the sort of lore of Alcatraz, where they're out there scoping out the island for this occupation, and then Richard, being this like kind of wild Mohawk man, decides that he's just gonna like rip off his shirt and dive into the water and start swimming towards Alcatraz Island, which is a really bad idea because the Bay Area is like as I said before, like the currents in the Bay Area are no joke. So he rips off his shirt, he starts swimming towards Alcatraz, he doesn't make it. But in the telling of this story, it's that moment that actually really sort of steals their commitment to occupying Alcatraz. And as I said, Eloy was close friends with Richard. And that's when they go and retake down. So I want to show real quick, this is one of my favorite photos, such a cool photo. That's actually in the prison. Obviously it's no longer a prison at the time, but this is a photo of many occupiers, really wonderful photo. And I wanted also really quickly to give you guys a sense for the occupiers' awareness of Alcatraz as a symbol, and almost sort of like a tongue-in-cheek symbol, actually. So I'm going to play this very brief clip of Richard Oakes talking about the occupation.
Hi, I have a proclamation I'd like to read you. We, the Native Americans, reclaim this land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years ago. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid when Manhattan Island was sold, but we know that land values have risen over the years. Our offer of $1.24 per acre is greater than 47 cents per acre the white man is now paying the California Indians for their land. We will give to the inhabitants of this island a portion of that land for their own, to be held in trust by the American Indian government. For as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers go down to the sea, to be administered by the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs. Hi, I have a proclamation I'd like to read you.
Oh, that's it, yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to play that clip because it's better than me explaining to you. The Alcatraz occupation was, yes, it was a protest, yes, it was an occupation, yes, it was righteous. It was also, I think, very self-aware, not self-conscious, that's different, but self-aware of its act as a performance, as a sometimes humorous, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, sometimes ridiculous performance, but a very important performance of, this idea, right? This idea of reclaiming native land, of claiming native treaty rights, and this idea of Alcatraz itself as a symbol. So there's this very famous quote that Richard Oakes also says, and he says, Alcatraz is an idea. And what he means by that is that when you come through New York Harbor on the East Coast, you're going to encounter the Statue of Liberty. This is the occupier's vision, right? If you come through New York Harbor on the East Coast, you're going to see the Statue of Liberty, which is one symbol of this nation's immigrant history and past, and one vision for liberty on this land. And when you come through the Golden Gate on the West Coast, you're going to encounter Alcatraz Island, this former federal prison. What an apt symbol of Native history, a former federal prison, this craggy rock, just like so many reservations that we were sent to, that is reclaimed as a symbol of Native freedom, Native sovereignty, Native self-determination, Native treaty rights. And it's actually during, as I said, this occupation of Alcatraz that President Richard Nixon, of all people, shifts federal Indian policy from a stated goal of termination to one of self-determination. This is a photo of Eloy on the right, with Elijah Oakes, Richard Oakes' grandson on the left, and then Richard Oakes above. There was actually a really good, I guess would be one way to put it, investigation into Richard Oakes' death by the San Francisco Chronicle. A few years after the Alcatraz occupation, Richard Oakes was actually gunned down by a vigilante in Santa Rosa, California. There was a really good investigation into that shooting by the San Francisco Chronicle that was published just last year, where they basically point to the fact that, like, you know, he was probably murdered, and the way in which the trial was handled was itself, you know, prejudiced. So anyways, that's that part of the story. I promised you guys it's something not depressing. I guess I couldn't help. I'll go back there. But you know, the important thing, I guess, is, oh, this clicker is not, there we go. Oh, it's just delayed. You know, the important thing is, though, is that this history is still very much alive in this community. So, you know, the last thing I want to talk about, I guess, in this sort of thing before turning to some concluding remarks, is a few years ago, I was part of a small grassroots effort to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Alcatraz occupation. So the 50 years since the Alcatraz occupation would be 2019. The origin of that is kind of funny. My dad and I, part of the reason I grew up in Oakland is that me and my dad didn't grow up together. I grew up with my mom. And my dad's the one who's from Canada. My dad and I have been reconnecting as adults. You can see some of that actually in the documentary. And part of the way in which we reconnected is that we participated in these Indigenous canoe journeys that happen in the Pacific Northwest, which is the part of the world that we come from. They're kind of annual. And we had just come back from a canoe journey to Campbell River, which is on the northeast sort of corner of Vancouver Island. And we were at the American Indian Art Market in Santa Fe, New Mexico, during the summer of 2017. And Eloy was with us because he's, like, you know, one of our favorite ride-along buddies. And my dad's an artist, and you know, when he's at an art show and he's not selling anything, he usually goes outside and smokes a little something to get over it. So him and Eloy are outside having a little smoke to get over the fact that dad's not selling his art. And you know, dad is talking about the fact that we just came back from this canoe journey, and Eloy's, you know, like, oh, it's about to be the 50th anniversary of the Alcatraz occupation. And in a moment of, I guess, Richard Oakes-esque kind of like brilliance, my dad is like, what if we bring a canoe journey to Alcatraz Island for the 50th anniversary of the occupation? And so against our better judgment, we did do that. Pretty crazy. And the idea basically was that, you know, it was that Alcatraz idea, right? That if we, through an action that was protest in a sense, but also performance, was also aware of the power of symbols, the power of Native bodies, the power of performance, brought canoes to Alcatraz Island for the 50 years of the occupation, we can reclaim this island that is still largely seen, like so much of the Bay Area, like so much of California, as this former federal prison and not as part of this important native history. We could reclaim it, at least for a day, as this symbol of native rights and sovereignty. And I don't know how to click play on this little thing, but just wanted to show you real quickly this performance, this video art installation. Maybe it won't work. Anyways, there's this. This is the last one. 15. Yeah, should be a video, and you go down a little bit. Yeah, go no. Use your clicker. You up a little to the left. Yeah. In the different versions of PowerPoint, I guess, to translate. So basically, there's this public art installation about the Alcatraz canoe journey that's going to happen. It's a piece by this guy named Kotozawa that I worked with, and it's like a illustrated video installation showing the canoes that came to Alcatraz. Really cool piece. It's too bad it didn't work today. So just to wrap up, because I've gone a little bit over, or no, I'm actually right on time. So in an early passage of Tommy Orange writes, quote, "Urban Indians feel at home walking in the shadow of a downtown building. We came to know the downtown Oakland skyline better than we did any sacred mountain range, the redwoods in the Oakland hills better than any deep wild forest. We know the sound of the freeway better than we do rivers, the howl of distant trains better than wolf howls. We know the smell of gas and freshly wet concrete and burned rubber better than we do the smell of cedar or sage or even fry bread, which isn't traditional, like reservations aren't tradition. But nothing is original. Everything comes from something that came before, which was once nothing. Everything is new and doomed. We ride buses, trains, and cars across, over, and under concrete plains. Being Indian has never been about returning to the land. The land is everywhere or nowhere." So when I introduced myself at the beginning of this talk, I spoke my language, and in our language, the Secwepemc language, we identify ourselves almost always as a person from a particular place. So Secwepemc means literally like the spread out people. And then when I identify the place that I'm from, I would say I'm Tsq'escen, which means I'm a person from Canim Lake, or from Broken Rock, as it literally means in our language. And that suffix that identifies a person of a place, muh, it's actually a very, very old Salish suffix. So linguists are able to trace back these sorts of things. And the suffix muh can be traced back to what linguists have reconstructed as sort of the Proto-Salish language, right? The language spoken by the ancestors of all Salish speakers today, something like 4,000 to 7,000 years ago. It's very, very ancient language. And in their sort of reconstruction of this language, they also like sort of identify what some of these terms mean across the commonalities of these languages. And muh, or tmir, this idea, it means person of, but it also means earth, it also means soil, it also means dirt, it also means place, it also means to milk or to nurse. And so within our language, right, at least within our Salish languages, there's this really ancient idea about our humanity, which is to say, and about our land and place, which is to say that people, as humans, we are all from particular places on this earth. We are of the land, and the land is also of the people. And to be indigenous and to be human is to have an attachment to a particular place on this earth. And to be a place is also to have an attachment to a particular group of humanity. And what I'm trying to suggest today, I guess, and what I think there really helps us think very, very specifically about, is that it is also possible, as someone who's been cut off from that history, from the places that we come from, through a history of genocide, of acculturation, of assimilation, of the forced removal of children, to have an Indigenous connection to a place that is itself part of a complicated history of colonization, of urbanization, that is not what we would traditionally imagine as an Indigenous homeland or an Indigenous place, a place like Oakland. And, like the characters that they're there, I come from Oakland. Yes, I come from Tsq'escen, but I also come from Oakland. And it has been really, really, it's been such a treat to have the opportunity to revisit my memories, my attachments, and my love for that place through an appreciation of Tommy Orange's really wonderful, wonderful novel, There. So thank you all for inviting me here to be part of your enormous book club. To take, to ride buses, trains, and cars across the concrete plains here to Bangor, Maine. And very much looking forward to the conversation the rest of the day. Thanks, Jen.